They do. I will say.
Okay, hi everyone. I just want to give you a few general updates as we kind of get closer to the end of the semester. So as you know, there are still reading assignments that you'll be doing weekly. There will be one final exam that is required of you. The final exam will be held during exam period. The exam, the start time is 3 o'clock. I think it goes until 5:30 or something like this. It's longer than the normal class time. The exam that I will design for the final will not be longer, right? It will still be the same length exam you've gotten used to. The only difference is that whereas it will be heavily weighted to this new material, that's what you're primarily going to be tested on, there will be a few questions that concern the previous topics, right? So it is cumulative. Those previous questions, though, will come from previous exams. So if you're uncertain about how you responded to some of those previous questions, just make sure to follow up, look at that exam, those exams, make sure you understand where you got things wrong in particular, so that you don't get them wrong again in case the same question shows up. Does that make sense? In terms of review session for that final exam, I actually do that the last class, so there won't be a separate one for the final. So the last class will be mostly review, although I usually I fall a little behind, as you've noticed. So it won't necessarily be the entire class, but it'll be most of it that I'll do a review, okay? And lastly, Thanksgiving, the Tuesday before the Thanksgiving break, that class is also canceled. So it's the full week off, right? Okay. Any general questions from you guys at this point? Okay. So I want to talk today about memory. That's going to be the focus. What comes to mind? What comes to your minds when I say memory? Yeah.
The hippocampus.
The hippocampus. How come?
I think I remember something about like cycle and and that's where some memories.
A lot of memories are being processed. I'm not going to say, we'll talk more about what those processes might be, that something like the hippocampus is doing. But yes, neurally, the hippocampus plays a big role in memory. Yeah.
Like working long-term memory?
Different types of memory basically comes to mind. Working, and do you think that those are I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think those are the only types of memory? Do you think there are others? Any thoughts?
Maybe.
Okay, maybe, good answer. Don't, not too committal, but those are two big types of memory. So we often think of types of memory. Yeah.
I think of neuroplasticity.
How so?
The ways that our memories are stored differently depends on changes in our brain. And the way that we remember things, like later in life we remember, we're less able to have new memories.
Yeah, so you're talking about memory formation. I think you're also talking retrieval. We'll use that language as we move forward. You're also talking about differences in time and development, right? Yeah.
One patient HM person,
Patient HM, how come?
because he had anterograde amnesia and he could not remember things after his hippocampus was, his whole medial temporal lobe area was kind of damaged.
Anterograde amnesia mean you can't form new memories,
Yeah.
right? Has anyone ever watched the movie Memento? Yeah, I mean it's kind of hit or miss. People either love it or hate it. I love it. I wouldn't take offense if you hate it. But it's about someone who experiences anterograde amnesia, meaning they can't form new memories, right? And going sort of through the strategies you would need to employ to be able to live a normal life if you weren't able to form new memories. What's also nice about patient HM and others who've suffered these issues, you also get a good sense of dissociations, right? Dissociations between different types of memory, showing that there are different neural mechanisms underlying different types of memory. So it's not all going to be hippocampus. Some will, and so if the hippocampus is affected in particular, then certain kinds of memory should be affected and not others, right? Which just supports the idea that not all memory is created equal, right? There are different types of memory. You might even then, as a consequence, make predictions about the potential for different types of memory following different developmental trajectories, for example, right? If it's not exactly the same. It doesn't have to, but it could, in principle, if there are dissociations. Okay. Distinguishing between colors. If I put up two patches of color, one red, one blue, and you were discriminating those, is that memory or not? Is there any memory there? Why didn't anybody bring up color perception as an example of something that comes to mind when you say memory?
What did they stay up? Yeah, probably.
They're gonna stay up, yeah. Is that memory? How come?
Because we're actively working with it.
So the information is available, the perception involves the direct comparison.
I mean, technically, I guess you could say yes, because you're remembering that red is red, and then that's, yeah, that's the mess I've got.
But I'm gonna come back to that. So what if I instead, for those of you who think that color perception in that example is not memory, what if I asked you whether, what if I asked which is more different? Red versus navy, or navy versus turquoise? Is the first pair more different or the second pair more different? Who says the first pair? Who says the second pair? I don't know if there's a right answer. I think it's the first pair, but regardless, is that memory? Why was that memory? Yeah.
There's still retrieval involved. We're thinking about what those colors look like.
You're not seeing those directly, right? So there's a way in which you're right that the first example of color perception is not classically memory, right? Unless you were, sort of using or bringing up a prototype of that color, sort of drawing on your category, your memory of what reds are, and maybe it helped you do the discrimination, right? That's possible. So in that sense, memory would be facilitating the color perception, right? So it's not independent of memory. The second example is a clear example of memory, right? Where you're recruiting some knowledge, past experience with those colors, right? You're not actually in the moment perceiving them, so you're having to call to mind some information about those colors. Now, when you are discriminating between two colors, there's a way in which perception, right, is still representing that information. There's a code in your brain, typically in regions of the ventral stream that are involved in color perception, that are being recruited, right? There's a representation there, so to speak. Your neurons are firing in particular ways that are decoding and encoding that information. So in sort of that sense, there's a kind of memory involved in that discrimination. It may not be the kind of memory that you're recruiting when, I don't know, you're remembering your previous birthday, right? But you could still talk about it as an encoding process that is within the domain of memories and the formation that goes into memories. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. Let me ask you guys, I like everything you said about what comes to mind. When do you think we start having memories? Yeah.
I know we don't remember anything before we're 3 or 4.
so it seems like we start having memories at 3 or 4. Do other people think that? Yeah.
I think we form memories at those ages, but we just don't retain them. And I think that's why we say we don't have memories from before then, because it doesn't serve us to retain them.
You don't think it serves a baby to remember their caregiver?
I think past 3, we don't remember anything from before then, because
Maybe you don't
But-
form memories longer than 3
But
years of age? Is
we
that it?
form,
Or for
I'm
longer than
saying,
3 years?
like, from birth, we have to form memories in order to interact with the world, but the reason why people often say, oh, my first memories at 3 is just because that's when we really start to retain them long term.
So, from one perspective, you don't start forming memories until about 3. From another perspective, maybe you are forming memories, but they're not long-term memories. So, does that seem okay? Yeah.
Would it, in that case, just mean like that different types of memories show up at different times in development? So, for example, in that case, we would learn in those first 3 years, we wouldn't retain like memories about events or like specific information, but like stuff that we learn how to do, for example, like tying our shoes and like her learning how to walk, that kind of thing. Like our brain still retain that sort of information and remembers how to do it.
So you're making the argument that maybe we form memories from birth and early on, but it's a different kinds of memories that are being formed. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I would say like, because a lot of memories that you form before 3 are not like, you don't have to use them every day. So for example, how you learn to walk, how you learn to talk, that becomes like procedural memories. And a lot of those memories like, where's your toy or something like that, they were like cleaned out because you have like a limited storage of memory. Then they got renewed. So sometimes people may forget like the thing that they did 5 years ago, even if they're not a child at then, because the memory is not useful.
It sounds almost like both of you guys are describing a case that is similar to the Memento character, HM. That, maybe like HM could tie his shoes, right? HM was fine walking around and stuff, but couldn't form new memories. So are we born HMs? Is that right? So we basically have anterograde amnesia until what, 3 or 4? Is that a possibility? Yeah.
I feel like the stuff that we remember though is like called embodied knowledge, where it's kind of things that like you just know how to do because you've done them for so long. But I think in terms of memory, I kind of agree like with what you were saying, like yeah.
I mean, these are all possible scenarios, right? We're then just gonna have to look at the data and figure out which one is right, if we're just looking at one versus the others, yeah.
I feel like there are other parts of the brain, like the cerebellum, amygdala, and stuff like that, things like that we use for motor functions, and we have even motor memory.
That's right. Right. Which is why it's great to think about one typically mentioned brain region, very important for memories, like hippocampus. But it's not that other brain regions involved in other motor perceptual processes aren't encoding information and keeping it stored, right? So it can be used for prediction and later on also, right? Which is why if you have brain damage to the hippocampus, for example, you're gonna have very severe amnesia, but other aspects of your life that implicate some type of other types of memory aren't necessarily affected, right? Okay, so these are some of the things we're gonna try to cover today and next class. I wanna start though with some accounts by people who've either experienced memory loss themselves, a type of memory loss themselves, or have seen it in a loved one. I want to just show you these quotes because I wanted to emphasize, maybe it goes without saying, how important memory is to daily functioning and ourselves as people and who we are and what it means to be a human, right? Who actually can call up information from the past. I used to ask students at one point, I don't think it was this class, what ability you would most hate to lose, right? Or something you'd hate to lose, right? And there's some obvious things that people say, like, I don't want to lose my arm or my leg, right? I don't want to lose my limbs, that would be annoying. Right? Another common one that people talk about is vision, right? People don't want to be blind. You don't want to lose your vision. And now that the class has had discussions about perception and early perceptual cognitive processes, it seems like it would be really bad when you lose those. People talk about how I would hate to lose language, right? What if I couldn't communicate? I wouldn't be a human, right? That would be awful. People almost never bring up memory, which I always found sort of interesting, and I think part of it is just you take it for granted, right? That it's just, it's so pervasive, you don't even think about it. It's not possible, right, to lose all of your memory, and because you just wouldn't, it's just unfathomable, right? People don't think about it. But again, when you lose it, there are aspects of memory, there are very profound consequences. So, this is a quote from someone talking about their loved one. Watching a loved one slip away in the labyrinth of memory loss is like trying to hold on to sand. The tighter you grasp, the more it slips through your fingers, leaving you with a sense of both longing and loss, right? This is not atypical among family members of people with Alzheimer's, dementia that involves profound loss involves profound loss of memory. People like an HM who've had a stroke or another kind of disease that affected their memory. It's like the person's not even your loved one, right? The memories make us who we are, so it can be very, very difficult. We also talked about another disorder in previous classes. This is someone with prosopagnosia. So remember, prosopagnosia is when you can't recognize people. Not only do you have difficulty discriminating people, where you could say that's more perceptual in nature, it's hard to recognize a family member, right? Because you have both perceptual and memory difficulties related to faces. In a sea of faces, each one a fleeting wave of familiarity, I find myself lost. Faces become fleeting echoes, and the struggle to remember leaves me adrift in a world where every gaze holds a question mark, right? So to hear someone talk about their lives in this way is quite sad, right? That you're unable to sort of function with other members of society because of the difficulty remembering the faces, right? Okay. So what I want to do next is talk about, get into the nitty-gritty of memory and what we mean by what memory is, the types of memory implicated. So in some sense, these early slides, and for this class in particular, it's going to be a bit more factual, I think, than usual, because I do think we have to get some terminology out of the way. And again, we have to talk about the different kinds of memory that we may have, so we can then also talk about their development. Okay. So when we're talking about memory, there's an aspect of memory that is very much about the process, right? On your way to forming memories and then actually getting access to them. So the first kind of process that's important for memory is what we call encoding, right? And this is what I was saying that even perception is doing, right? It's forming a representation of the external world in your mind. This is saying nothing about how long it's in your mind. It may not be in your mind very long, but at minimum, you need to encode some information. If you don't encode the information, then there's no talk of memory, right? If someone says, oh, why don't you remember me? I met you the other day. It's not, maybe you're having trouble remembering that person, retrieving that information from your mind, but maybe you weren't even paying attention to them to begin with. So you didn't even register them, right? You didn't even encode any information about them. So all memory formation has to start with this encoding process, right? Okay. a big part of memory involves consolidation. So when you form a representation of the external world, we want to maintain that information. There has to be a maintenance of the information so that it can last over a period of seconds, minutes, hours, years, and so on, right? So there's consolidation. And what's important about these two processes is they're going to be happening in different brain regions and at different times, right, on your way to forming your memories. So when we talk about memory, these are the processes implicated in memory. And we need not just encoding, we need consolidation, and then ideally there would be retrieval, right? A memory is only useful if you can retrieve it and gain access to it when it's needed. When we talk about problems with memory, then it could be at any of these levels, right? We may not know unless we probe further. So if someone can't remember something, it may be a problem with retrieval, right? That the memories were formed, they were encoded, they were consolidated, but now you can't get access to them, right? Like when you're on a computer trying to find your file, maybe it's corrupted, right? It's there, but you can't get access to it. That would be a problem with the retrieval process. But memory problems could also happen at these other levels, right? Maybe you have an issue, a problem with consolidation for whatever reason, and we'll talk a little bit about what those reasons might be. So these are the different levels that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about memory formation, okay? Okay, so types of memory and their relations. I want to make clear that even though these memories that I said could be dissociable, it's not that they don't interact with one another, and in some cases it's very necessary that they interact with one another. So here are the three I want to focus. We mentioned working memory and long-term memory when I was asking you what comes to mind. We didn't talk about sensory memory, but I will, and I'll show you some examples of it. These different types of memory have different characteristics associated with each of them, and we can very carefully make those comparisons. I should also say that typically speaking, I'll get to the characteristics in just a second, but typically speaking, how this process unfolds along the processing stream when it comes to memories is that memory comes in through, you form memories by interacting with the world, and usually through sensory information, right? The things you see, the things that you hear. When you follow sensory memory, you're then talking typically about working memory. That said, not all of sensory memory makes its way into working memory, right? But when it does, working memory is the part of memory that is considered very active, right? Where you can manipulate information in your mind. This is not the case in sensory memory, right? Sensory memory, which again we'll talk more about, comes in through your senses, vision, audition, for example. It might be stored for a certain amount of time, but it's kind of just, it's passively there, right? You can't get in there and change what you see in the world, right? It's very difficult to look out into the world as you impinge on my sensory memory and override that with some other information, right? To think of you as a redhead, right? Instead of a blonde, or to see you that way, right? That just is not really possible. Working memory is different because it is considered very active and a type of process that involves manipulation of information in your mind. Okay, and then if working memory is such that you engage in longer term consolidation, the information that went through working memory will make its way into long-term memory. And the key with long-term memory is exactly what it says. It is long-term. It stays there potentially indefinitely, right? Though if we lived, forever, it should be able to stay there indefinitely, at least some memories. Okay. The other thing I will point out is that the relations are not just asymmetric, and they don't fully go in just the one direction from sensory to working memory to long term. Many times, long-term memory influences your working memory. So you take information that you have stored in long-term memory, you bring it into working memory, and you think about it, you can manipulate it in your mind, right? So this is a very common thing that happens, that long-term memory affects working memory, and that you can then manipulate it again in working memory. Information that's in long-term memory is also passive. It's not being worked on. If you're going to work on your long-term memory, if you're going to think about, a previous birthday party, and you want to think about what could have happened if someone else had been there and so on, right? That's not happening in long-term memory. That is the long-term event making its way into your working memory store and the manipulation happening there. Make sense so far? Okay. Sensory memory. Here are some characteristics that are not exclusive to sensory information, to sensory memory. Some of these characteristics will overlap with the other types of memory. Some are going to be unique. Sensory memory is massive. As I look around the world and information about your appearances, right? The perceptual information I'm seeing as I look around at all of you and having some of that stored in my sensory memory. This is a lot. This is a lot of color information, a lot of face information, and so on, right? So it's really quite massive, right? Basically whatever you can get in your visual field in some sense, or that you could hear, you'd be able to store in sensory memory. It's highly detailed. I'm getting a lot of detailed information, again, as I look around at all of you, with respect to the shape of your faces, your hair, your clothes, and so on. So these two characteristics, I think, are pretty clear for sensory memory. The third thing, though, is it's incredibly short in duration. Now, 3 seconds isn't nothing, right? It's still somewhat substantial, I guess. But it tends to be very short. And it makes a lot of adaptive sense that it would be short, right? I want to be able to look around the world, see you, recognize you, have some representation of all of you. But it would not be ideal if I walked out of this classroom and that's basically still in my memory, right? It would interfere with my ability to process other kinds of information, right? So I want my sensory information to be detailed. Ideally, yes, it's very high capacity, but it shouldn't last very long. It would be massively disruptive if that information was lingering as you're moving around the world, right? And going from place to place. Okay, so that's sensory memory. Working memory, much smaller in capacity. We'll talk about what that capacity is in just a little bit. It's also a lot less detailed, the information that you have in your mind in working memory compared to sensory memory. It does last longer than a sensory memory because you're actively trying to keep the information in mind in a way that you don't have control over your sensory memory. But you do have some control over your working memory. We will talk about how in working memory, because it's active, there are things like rehearsal that you can do to keep something in your working memory. Other strategies you can use to sort of prolong the duration. It's not going to be forever, right? If the information is being held on for a while, then usually what's happened is it's moved into longer term memory and is now a different kind of memory that you can store for many, many years, right? And not just seconds. So this is sort of on average. So some clear differences between sensory and working memory. Okay. Long-term memory shares some similarities with the others. It is massively large. Again, I'm going to use potentially infinite if we had access to information, right? We don't have any sense of how big it could be because the more people can just keep remembering more and more things, right? There's some individual differences, but it tends to be quite large, right? The information that makes it into long-term memory. I have less detailed question mark here because it was for a long time considered to be much less detailed than a sensory memory, for example. But people are now finding that you can have very vivid memories of things that happened maybe 20, 30 years ago, right? So at least in some cases, the level of detail in working memory is actually quite large and more than we previously assumed. Okay, and duration again, massive, right? If we live forever, it could probably be forever in many people. Okay, any questions about all of this? Okay. So in terms of these directions, I want to highlight that there are contextual factors or other factors that influence. For example, whether something goes into from sensory to working memory and from working memory into long-term memory and vice versa. Let me just first also say before I get to those additional factors, you can break these down into subcomponents. I've already kind of said this as I was talking through sensory memory because I would say, you know, it's stuff that you can see or hear. So there are different kinds of sensory memory. One kind is related to vision, the other to audition. In the literature, people will refer to these as iconic and echoic, but it's basically vision versus audition. Those are the most prevalent that people have studied in terms of sensory memory. I don't know of a lot of people looking at sensory memory for something like haptics. I suppose we're going to have some of that, right, in terms of how things feel or their weight, maybe. But this is the two types of sensory memory we know a lot about. Okay, in working memory, there are also two types. Maybe you've heard of these in other courses. Visual spatial working memory, the often called the sketch pad is how it sounds. When you're manipulating in your mind visual spatial kinds of information, right? When you're thinking about some puzzle you want to do and how the pieces fit, right? You're doing that using your visual spatial sketch pad. Much more likely than you would be using the phonological loop. So the phonological loop tends to be the working memory that is linguistic. When you're, I'll get to this example later, when someone gives you your phone number, even though, like I said before, no one knows phone numbers anymore, right? But if you didn't have your own phone, and you really had to remember someone else's phone number, then you would rehearse and you would try to remember those numbers, right? That's a phonological working memory. It's not a visual spatial one, right? But if someone says, I want you to go to the Home Depot and buy this color paint, right? And they don't allow you to take a swatch with you or something, right? You have to remember in visual spatial working memory, keep that kind of color in mind, right? Yeah.
Okay, so the phonological loop is focused more on like words and that sort of thing?
So here, sensory memory, we're really kind of dividing up sensory memory based on the senses, right, and the type of perceptual information that's being encoded. Here, we're kind of focusing on the content of the working memory. When you're doing that active manipulation and thinking about something in your mind because you're rehearsing it or trying to solve a kind of puzzle using note, paper and pencil kind of thing and working through it in your mind, it looks like we have different brain regions that work through the visual spatial stuff versus the phonological, more linguistic stuff. These are dissociable. They do tend to be related insofar as if you're looking at, instead of brain damage, if you're looking at like individual differences, remember we talked about how there can be dissociations where, and domain specificity if you're good at math, but less good at, I don't know, reading, right? Or vice versa. In general, these do tend to be correlated, which means that if you have high visual spatial working memory, you tend to also have high phonological loop with respect to working memory. but it's not perfectly correlated, right? So it means that they still can be dissociated. And that's not surprising because it is different content, right? Is that clear? Okay. And then long-term memory, this tends to be what people are most familiar with. So in long-term memory, we can have what's called implicit or procedural memory, right? This is riding a bike. It's in your body, right? It's hard to talk through. It's implicit. Tying a shoe, right? Knowing how to eat at the table with, which fork and stuff to use and how to use it, right? That's the kind of procedural implicit stuff. Declarative or explicit. Within this type of long-term memory, there are also two types. And I'm bringing up these different types because, again, at some level, there's evidence that they can be dissociated, either because of the neural mechanisms that are underlying them, because of individual differences that you see across them, right? Because, again, of damage that can impact just one type and not the other. So whenever I break these things down, it means that somewhere there is some evidence, right, suggesting that you can dissociate these. So within declarative memory, there's evidence that you can also dissociate between two types of declarative or explicit memory. One is semantic, the other one is episodic. Do you guys know what these are? What's semantic memory? Thoughts? Yeah.
Just like plain old facts.
Facts? Like when you know what the capital of Canada is, right? What's the capital city of Canada? Does anyone know this? This always breaks my heart. Who thinks it's Toronto? Who thinks it's Montreal? Who thinks it's Ottawa? Yay! Having that knowledge is semantic long-term memory. It's memory for facts, okay? Different types of facts. It could be geography, it could be political, whatnot, right? Episodic is what? Do you know what episodic memory is?
Isn't it like events and like tied to like specific emotions too?
It doesn't have to be, but it is events, and it's events that are tied to you in particular. We'll get to emotion in a second. It doesn't have to be tied to emotion. It often is, which we'll talk about. But in principle, it doesn't. It's more the memories that concern yourself, right, and your life. So I used the example of the birthday party, right, or the birthday. That would be episodic memory. It's not factual. It's an event that happened to you. And so there you have those personal memories. Okay, so these are all the different types. I think I've been pretty exhaustive here. People who study memory, I don't study memory, but people who do might be able to break this up further. But I think, like I said, this is pretty exhaustive. Okay, so going back to what I was mentioning before, when you talk about these directions from sensory to working and long-term and back, there are factors that impact the movement across the memory processing. So one example, we've already heard emotion, is attention and emotion. The extent to which you're paying attention to something, the extent to which you're feeling a positive versus a negative emotion has an impact on whether the sensory information makes its way into working memory, and then whether it even makes its way into long-term from working memory, okay? So attention and emotion is something we can talk about as relevant for understanding this path. Sleep is a great one. I love the research on sleep and memory. I think it's so fun. Sleep has an impact in terms of working memory getting into long-term memory. Have you heard about this idea? So let me ask you, here's a scenario. So you're studying for this exam and you want to do really well, though you're only doing it the night before, unfortunately, right? It's always challenging. So you have two choices. One is you can stay up all night, think through all the material, try to learn all the material, memorize all the relevant facts. The other option is you study less, and you go to bed for a couple of hours, right? what do you think is the better approach to doing well in general, on average? Is it the first scenario? Work at it. Put as much time as you can into remembering the material. Or don't put in as much time and go get some sleep. No judgment. Which do you think is better? Yes.
Probably the Uncle Night.
How come?
It's the day before.
You gotta get as much information as you
If you
can.
haven't studied at all first.
Yes, you haven't studied at all.
Yeah, I would need to stay up all night.
Stay up all night. That's usually a good strategy. I can't believe I'm saying that. Better to study than not study, right? Yeah.
I also think like sleep is important though, so I think like if you don't study like as much but you get like a good night's rest, that's like better than like staying up all night.
How come? Come on, tougher.
Something like
Work
sleep,
through it.
like solidifies the information and like your neurons like fire when you're asleep, so it like solidifies it more in your memory or something like that.
Yeah.
Sleep deprivation has a lot of negative effects on the body.
Yeah, so there's one way in which you can talk about sleep being good for the memory, and another way in which you can emphasize if you don't sleep, this is the negative impact too, right? So there's two sides to that coin potentially, yeah.
Also, sometimes when you're really tired and you've been studying for a couple of hours, you don't like actually retain anything because it's like you're distracted and not focused.
Yeah, so sleep deprivation in general is bad in terms of just intaking information, right? And starting with the encoding, right? So not getting sleep can make it difficult to even encode the information. But maybe you have some coffee, right? Or not some, maybe you have a lot of coffee and that helps, right? So there's some ways to counteract at least that part of it, maybe, right? Yeah.
Doesn't sleep deprivation also affect like your recall abilities and like your performance?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say then is that when you're talking about the other part of it and why it might be good is I was hearing the term solidify. That's I think what solidify. I actually want you to say something else, which basically is similar. Consolidate. Right? So sleep is very well known to be implicated in that process I mentioned of consolidation. It can of course affect encoding because again, especially if you're sleep deprived, encoding the very start of it may be difficult. But even more profound that the research has shown is that it's critical for consolidation. And sometimes you don't even need a lot. So if you have a choice between no sleep and staying up, and guess what? I did a lot of that. I don't do as much anymore because I'm not studying for exams, right? But I stay up all night all the time before an exam if, I was only able to study the day before. But better if you could even get an hour. Force yourself to go sleep for an hour because selfishly you will do better on the test. Those memories will be consolidated. And it will help retain that information and pull it up on the exam. So, like I said, I'm all for studying as much as you can, but also you need to consolidate those memories. And that's a challenge that people have, right? And it's a shock when you've studied all night, you think you know the information, and then you go to the test, and it feels like you forgot a lot of it. And you probably did because those memories didn't consolidate. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of consolidation that happens during memory. Oftentimes, it is unknown to you that this is happening in your brains. Other times, people talk about how they kind of know it's happening because there's some retrieval that's happening in their dreams, right? Don't you hate this? Like, you studied for several hours and then you kind of want a break and then you go to sleep and you dream about the material. It's good though, right? It just proves to you that the consolidation is happening. Okay, so I really do love sleep research for this reason. It has really honed in on one part of that processing that is implicated in memory, which is the consolidation. So again, even just an hour, force yourself. you will reap the benefits instead of staying up all night. Okay, any questions about all of this so far? Okay, this is especially important, these things, as you're moving towards long-term memory and looking to store memory long-term and potentially indefinitely. There are other examples of these factors, other variables that implicate memories. In this case, it's more about retrieval and now bringing long-term memory, for example, into working memory. So this is also very important for doing well on exams, right? Because again, your goal is to get it into long-term memory so you can do well on the exam and hopefully beyond that, although I know that that can be a challenge, right? I had an undergrad professor who used to get very frustrated and then he would yell at us. Right back in the day, you could do that and not get in trouble. He would yell at us because it was like he wanted us to maintain our memories beyond the classroom, and he was always very incredibly frustrated by the fact that students had what he called term-to-term memory, right? He's like, it's as if you go write your exam and then you actively say, I don't want to remember any of that again, right? And he knew, and he would make that argument, or he would bring that up because he would have students in then a subsequent class where he was building off the material from before, and he's like, what happened? You took my previous class. How did you forget this, right? So he would talk about term-to-term memory, right? But I'm bringing this up because we do know that memories are maintained longer and you're able to retrieve them better if the contextual information remains the same. So, you know, you have the experience, like you can't remember something, what's like on the tip, that name, that restaurant, whatever, it's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't say it. And it can help if you get a cue that triggers that memory, right? That cue that can trigger that memory is what we call the contextual information that was associated with the memory formation that then also helps you retrieve it. We'll talk more about context specificity later, but it is an important part of being able to bring long-term memories into working memory and essentially retrieving them. Here's something I also really find fascinating. This is actually some work I have done in my lab where we know that anxiety can affect your ability to bring long-term memory information into working memory, okay? And I can talk a little bit more about that later. Okay. So I already asked you about what you thought when it comes to memory and when you think memories are being formed and when it starts over development. Oftentimes, talking about this kind of issue is preceded by a question like, what's your earliest memory, right? So I'm seriously asking, what's your earliest memory? Anyone willing to share the first memory they have access to in their lives? Yeah.
My parents dropped me off in like kindergarten or something, and it's like, and I remember being like below my mom's waist. Like my mom's like 5'4", and she's super short, and I remember seeing like her.
Okay, it's not that short. Go on. And how were you feeling? Do you remember how you were feeling?
I remember I was very overwhelmed because like it was really crowded because it was like.
So it doesn't sound like you were excited to go to school.
No,
or even if you were, at that moment, you were feeling...
No, it's just because it was like a narrow sort of like hallway with like a bunch of kids walking with their parents. Cause it was
that
the first
doesn't
day of
sound
school.
pleasant.
That sounds like claustrophobia.
Yeah, like this sounds like an awful first day of school. Yeah.
This sounds kind of believable, but I think my first memory is from when I was 2 years old. My brother was playing with TV cables, and he pulled it, and the whole TV dropped on my forehead. I had a very big bump. I don't remember it dropping on my head, but I remember my mom like putting ice into this little cloth and pressing it against my forehead and how much it hurt also. But I swear that's my
You think you were around 2 or older?
I was 2.
You're positive?
I'm pretty positive.
People confirm it for you?
Yeah.
Okay. Any others?
I went to a cave for the first time and got to touch like the ice glaciers that were dripping down.
Oh, well that
It was,
sounds
like, 3
pleasant.
days before, yeah.
Yeah, you?
I think it was like taking a picture with Mickey Mouse and Minnie in Disneyland, and I wasn't sure about this memory until like I saw a picture of that, and I was just, like I had.
So are you sure you had the memory before you saw the picture, or did the picture
I wasn't.
implant that memory in your mind?
I wasn't sure I had that memory, but I
Okay.
think I had like some pictures.
Okay. How old were both of you? You were how old?
1 or 2.
1 or 2? Okay, we'll get back to that. I'm gonna leave you for a second. I'm dubious, but we'll get back. How old were you?
3 or 4.
3 or 4? You? Yeah.
I was in kindergarten and I got accused of like copying my friend on some like fake math assignment and
In kindergarten?
In kindergarten.
Oh, that sounds intense.
Yeah, my school was crazy. But I was very
But you feel you got in trouble.
I got in trouble, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that was PK or something, and then I screamed out, like I was very obnoxious in class, and the teacher made me stand up so I didn't raise my hand for like.
Oh. See, you can't do that anymore.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
My earliest memory, I think, was when I was like 6, and I was pushing my friend up the hill, like with a bike, because we lived on a hill. And my brother was going down the hill, and he cracked his head open, and he ran into my cousin. And it was my birthday.
6?
So, 6, yeah.
What do these? Yeah. Go. What do these memories have in common? Any similarities? I mean, they're obviously all very different events. Yeah.
They're very emotional.
They're very emotional. Oftentimes, it's negative, right? Getting in trouble, crying, feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes it is positive, like meeting Mickey Mouse, and although I suppose I'm gonna come back to it because you were 1 or 2, right? Okay, let's leave that one aside. Oftentimes they are negative, right? But they can also be very emotional. It's not uncommon for people to say, I remember my 4th birthday, right? I had, oh no, we're also talking about like the cave and stuff, right? So they can be very happy too, they're not just negative, but they do tend to be highly emotional. The age was pretty constant, right? What, anywhere from maybe 3 to 6, with the exception of the very young one, right? But in general, it's around that age range. So that's pretty typical. Not typical is someone saying, I remember being in my crib and getting my first pacifier. Wow, that was soothing, right? Or I was in my crib, I lost my pacifier, and that was very upsetting, right? This is not common. Also not common is, it was some spring day, and I was walking along with my mom, and we stopped at the neighborhood grocery store, right? Some just sort of neutral event, not typical, right? So much more typical is anything that is around 3 years of age and up, and more typical are things that are highly emotional, right?
I have a
Question.
So like, I've like thought about what my first memory is like a lot, and I have a lot of memories from my early childhood, but I can never like figure out which one was my first memory. Like I can't like figure out what age were all of my memories.
Fair enough.
How does that like, how do people know like what age that something happened was?
One is there's probably a lot of inaccuracies actually, right? Don't assume that these are the exact memories that were their first that people reported. They have a rough idea that maybe this is their first, they have a rough idea of the age and so on. So they're not always accurate. But on average, people are calling something to mind that they really think is that earliest one, right? It may not be the only one, it may be another, and maybe on a different day they'll describe a different one. But it tends to have these characteristics, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like I was gonna say a similar thing because I heard somewhere that like when you think that far back, your memories could be inconsistent. Like the earliest one I remember was because it was dated because it was like a Ben 10 marathon. It was like on 10, 10, 10. so it was like 10, 10 for the whole day.
Yeah,
So it would be like 4.
Yeah. The reason I was saying I was dubious about the really early memories, it's not impossible that It's very unlikely, given what we know about the neural mechanisms and how memories are formed, that you would have access to an accurate memory before around the age of 3. It's unlikely, given everything we know. Like I said, it's not impossible, but very unlikely. And oftentimes, when you do have what you think is a vivid memory of a very early event, like you with your pacifier, for example, it's usually what we call kind of implanted insofar as you didn't really have that memory. You saw, maybe people told you about it enough that now you can't think you remember it, right? Maybe you saw it in a photograph, so again, you think maybe you just lose track of the source. And in that case, I'm not necessarily saying that's happened with you, but but it is often, it is a common thing that can happen when they're really, really early.
I mean, like, I wanted to bring it up because I wasn't sure if I had this memory. So, or is
Kidding,
it
I'm teasing you.
just like the
Yeah.
photograph?
It could be, and oftentimes it is, right? That it kind of gets implanted, not in sort of a malicious way, right? Again, you just lose track of the source. And we have these source monitoring problems all the time, right? Where we remember something. Maybe the source monitoring problem is you think you said it. This happens to me all the time, especially if it's a smart idea, right? I think I said it. when maybe it came from someone else, right? So that happens all the time. Was there someone? Yeah, go for it.
I think also similar to that idea, like I remember when I'd been talking to my mom about this, I remember this one time, like when I put something in, I remember being in the kitchen, my head hurt, you put something on the coffee, like it hurt so bad, and she was the one who was like, oh, this is when you were 2 and when like your brother dropped the TV on your head, so it also is like.
But that kind of traumatic thing, it's interesting because, you know, way back when people were talking about, I should just put it up here, what we call infantile or childhood amnesia, right? People like Freud used to say that it's especially the negative stuff that we're not going to remember because you want to repress them, right? And there's some truth to that. Sometimes if something is so negative and so extreme, you try to actively not remember it, or somehow your mind and brain has developed this coping strategy by which you try to repress it, right? So that can happen. But more often than not, a little bit of negativity actually helps maintain a memory, right? Okay, so yes, this is known as infantile childhood amnesia, which is just this general phenomenon, right? That typically speaking, adults are unable to recall events prior to 3 or 4 years of age, right? This is very common. It's a big area of study in the developmental work, trying to sort of figure out why this happens, why it's difficult to reliably remember anything prior to this age. And there are characteristics, as I said. I did mention that they tend to be emotional, either positive or negative, and not totally neutral. The other thing I forgot to mention is they tend to be personal, right? They're episodic memories. Your first memory doesn't tend to be, learning about the capital city of Canada. Your earliest memory doesn't tend to be the semantic knowledge and how that was formed, right? So they do tend to be episodic in nature, like birthday parties, like trips, some going to the doctor, things like that. Okay, I'm going to hold off on this we're going to come back to understanding the infantile childhood amnesia. I just want to switch gears a little bit in relation to this idea that emotionality is an important factor and contributes to memories getting into long-term memory in particular. So this has been very well studied, and it's often sort of real-world events. You can track people who've experienced a general traumatic event and see the extent to which they remember those events. So for me, it's 9/11, and it's very memorable, in part because I had just moved to the US from Canada 2 weeks before, so I was brand new to the US. But obviously, it's happening live. I did see it live because I had friends who were calling me at like 8 in the morning or 8:30 or whatever it was. And no one calls me at that time because I'm normally not up. I wasn't up then, I'm not up now. But, so I knew something had to be wrong because otherwise you wouldn't be calling at that time. And it was a friend of mine saying, I think you should move back. The U.S. is under attack. Which was just a perfectly plausible interpretation, right? You gotta get back. Leave that place. So anyway, and then my roommate and I, who didn't know each other very well, we just moved to go to school there. This was Chicago, and we spent the day watching this on TV, as did everybody else, right, experiencing this. It's a highly emotional event, and it's an event that people remember very well. There are other events like this from history, right? People talk about the JFK assassination. People talk about the Challenger, I think it was the Challenger exploding, right, that people saw on TV, they saw together, it was very emotional, and its memories we do seem to store long term. They also tend to be quite detailed. They have all of those characteristics of long-term memory. And they're remembered more vividly and longer term than just random things, right? So this again is the connection between memory and memory and emotion. Elizabeth Phelps, who used to be at NYU, she's now at Harvard. She does work on memory and the neural basis of memory. She did all this really cool work. She was at NYU at the time, and she did work looking at the extent to which proximity to the World Trade Centers impacted your memory, and it was very reliable in that the closer you were, the more emotional you were, the more you remembered the details of the event and so on. So there's been a lot of work looking at, again, this relation between emotion and long-term memory, especially for these kinds of events. I just want to mention one other issue that I think is relevant for thinking about, again, all of the types of memory and the transitions between sensory, working, and long-term. I also mentioned attention and emotion, but I'm actually going to be a bit more specific and talk about maybe arousal more specifically. Arousal and emotion sometimes go hand in hand. They're not exactly the same in that with emotion, you can distinguish between positive and negative emotions, the valence of the emotion. Arousal doesn't care whether the emotion is positive or negative. It just means you're in a state of heightened, it can be anxiety, it can also be sort of heightened attention caused by the arousal. This kind of state has an impact, particularly when it comes to encoding of information. It can have an impact when it also means consolidating and going into long-term memory. But let me show you an example of the kind of encoding that arousal can affect. So suppose you take a very basic perception task that involves visual discrimination. Ignore these for a second. That involves discrimination of these patches. So these patches in vision are known as Gabor filters. They're just like these black-white orientations. And on a task like this, you would be shown pairs of these images. And the task would be very simple. Are the orientations you're seeing, let's look at the most obvious one here, are they the same or different, right? So you'd say different. They're different orientations. But they could be the same. Now, the task, you can manipulate the difficulty of the task in a couple of different ways. One is to make the orientations a little less dissimilar. These are really different ones, but they could be they could be more aligned. That makes it harder. The other way to make it harder is to mask the images. So it's like you have like kind of a filter over it. So these are going to be a lot harder to see than these, right? So you can manipulate the difficulty. This is important because you want to ask, can you improve manipulating something like arousal. Okay. So one way to manipulate arousal in the lab is maybe you give people a shock, right? They get very tense, they get anxious, right? Especially if they're expecting another shock, right? You could do that, but you don't even have to, right? You can do something much more subtle. So the way it's been more typical here, and again, this is work by Liz Phelps that was at NYU, is right before you make the judgment of same versus different, you are presented with a face that is exhibiting an emotion, or that is neutral, right? So neutral face, happy face, fearful face, okay? And typically what you find is that people, when they see these faces, and if they're presented them over and over again, the more negative ones, even the positive ones, lead to more arousal in someone. If you just measure their heart rate, for example, their heart rate increases when looking at emotional faces compared to neutral faces, right? So it's a very subtle manipulation, but it works. The way it works is that if arousal goes up, especially if it's negative emotional expressions, you're better at visual discrimination, right? So why would that be? So the idea is that when you're in a heightened state of arousal, it heightens your attention, and your visual discrimination in a case like this is better, right? So it's a good thing in some ways to have increased arousal because it improves the discrimination and presumably the encoding that's happening here. Yeah.
In the situation where the arousal is stress, wouldn't it be that because your body is so incredibly like focused on the flight or fight mechanism, all of these doesn't really matter?
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that, but it's a good point, and I'll just clarify here. With all of these effects, there's a sweet spot, right? There's sort of an optimal level of negative emotion, you know, for maintaining something in long-term memory or arousal. Anything that is too high, for example, you know, if, you know, I don't know, if I had a family member that actually died during 9/11, maybe that is so traumatic that it interferes with my memory of some of the details, right? But experiencing it from afar and having maybe what you would consider sort of that optimal emotional experience does enhance the memory. Same thing here, right? If you're so terrified and like, because these shocks are so extreme, you're not going to be better, you're going to be worse. So we really are in all of these cases talking about an optimal level of negative valence or arousal. Yeah.
Just to clarify, it doesn't matter if it's a positive or negative emotion.
Both negative and positive are better than neutral. You see the effects for both of those. So in both cases, you're better than when you just are primed with the neutral, but there is a slight advantage for negative. So it's negative followed by positive followed by neutral. It may not be negative or positive per se. It may be instead that negative emotionality tends to increase arousal, right? So it's because it actually is very hard to match negative and positive experiences for arousal, because oftentimes negative always gets a bump. It's always a bit more arousing. It's easier to get very negative and overwhelmed and anxious than it is to even get happy, right? It's too bad, but that's the way it is. So it can be really hard to match. So it's probably less. That's why I'm saying both are better than neutral, which is the key thing. But yes, it's a slight bump for negative, probably because it also bumps you up a little bit for arousal. Not excessively in this case, right? Because like I said, these are just faces you're looking at. This is not an actual shock or anything. If we were giving you excessive shocks, maybe the performance would start to break down because it would be too much and it's the optimal level. I will take this opportunity also, like to give you little strategies for doing better on your exams. This is why a little arousal is also really good for studying and retrieval, right? You don't want to be too calm. It turns out, I know, crazy that I'm saying that. It turns out that a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of arousal will help you encode information better, process the information better. Again, it's the sweet spot though, right? Because if it's too much, you're going to be overwhelmed and you're not going to be able to study at all. But a little bit of arousal improves encoding, And it also turns out it ends up improving retrieval. But again, so I've often joked with students where I'm like, how do you feel? And they're like, I'm good. I'm like, not too good, right? You want to be a little bit anxious before you take the exam. It helps you read the questions more clearly, process the information again, because the arousal is good for this. So yes, so this is emotion, arousal, all having impact on memories, get into long-term memory, and then also the later retrieval, like in the 9/11 case. Okay. We have 5 minutes left, but I'm actually going to stop. The next bit is going back to infantile and childhood amnesia. We'll talk about this next class. So I'll see you then.